This is the story of Air Bulgaria Charter Flight 8115. On the 16th of July 2018, an MD-82 was flying from Catania Airport to, this place is in France, and I'm probably going to butcher how I say it, to Tarbes-Lourdes-Pyrénées Airport in France. Okay, how did I do on the pronunciation? Let me know in the comments. The day for the crew of Flight 8115 started at 4 a.m. when they arrived at the airport to start the duties that they would need to do to get this plane safely into the air. They got to the airport and they went over the weather at their origin and their destination, and they came to the conclusion that the first officer would be the one that would be flying the plane today. As the captain walked around the airplane and updated the onboard databases, the plane was fueled for the roughly 6-hour flight, and the passengers began boarding the airplane. Then at 5:12 a.m. local time, the plane lined up with runway 08 of Catania Airport, and the pilots pushed the engines to max power, and the plane began rolling down the runway. In seconds, the plane was airborne, and the plane was leaving Italy behind, and Flight 8115 made its way towards French airspace. The plane cruised at around 33,000 feet, and by the time it was over Barcelona, it was time for them to start their descent. There was some weather activity up there, so the pilots vectored around the weather. At 7:11 a.m., the plane started making its way down. It wasn't a smooth ride down. The plane was buffeted by moderate amounts of icing and turbulence, but nothing so serious that they'd have to abandon the approach and go to one of their alternates. At 7:20 a.m., ATC allowed the plane to get lower, all the way down to 8,000 feet till they reached the waypoint TEPTI. By the time that they were at TEPTI, they got vectored for the waypoint Tango Bravo Oscar, and while they carried out those instructions, the approach controller got in contact with the pilots and cleared them for the ILS Zulu approach to runway 20. Flight 8115 was minutes away from landing. The pilots of Flight 8115 wanted to know the weather at the field. What they got back was promising. Visibility was at 5 kilometers or 3 miles. They had a few clouds at 1,900 feet, scattered clouds at 2,500 feet, and it was overcast at 4,300 feet. Again, not bad weather, and nothing that would jeopardize the safety of Flight 8115. The pilots prepped the plane to land as they avoided some cumulonimbus clouds. But the plane was still being buffeted by turbulence. As the plane passed through 10,000 feet, the pilots broke through the weather and they finally had a good visual on the airport. As the jet lined up with the runway, the plane was handed off to the tower frequency. When the jet was 4 nautical miles away from the runway, ATC gave the pilots a new weather update, just to make sure that they were in the know, just so that they had all the information that they needed to make a safe landing at the airport. Wind was coming in from 200 degrees at 10 knots and the runway was wet. Again, not great, but not bad either. By the time the plane hit 2,400 feet in altitude, it was steady as a rock. This plane was coming down and it had satisfied all of its final approach fix criteria. This looked like it would be a solid landing. Then, as they got lower, the first officer turned off the autopilot and took manual control of the plane. This could not have come at a worse time for Flight 8115. The airplane was suddenly hit by strong winds and rain hammered the aircraft. The first officer was fighting a losing battle. This plane was no longer on the correct glide path or lined up with the runway in the way that it should be. The plane was well under the glide slope. The captain saw what was happening and he took control of the plane, and he took the plane into a right-hand bank and increased pitch aggressively. The plane continued to lose altitude as the pilots wrestled with the controls of the jet. By this point, the rock-solid approach that they had before was nowhere to be seen, and everything was out of bounds. Right now, it would be a great time to go around and try again, but they did not do that. The pilots kept going with the approach. With the approach looking more and more shaky, the captain disabled the autothrottle. He kept pulling back on the yoke, but the plane was not climbing as they expected it to. The nose of the plane went from 4 degrees to 11 degrees, and yet the plane did not gain any altitude. If anything, it was losing a little bit of altitude. The jet was still 480 meters from the threshold of the runway, but it was at 40 feet in altitude. For some context, that's about like 8 Danny DeVitos. Not a whole lot of Danny DeVitos if you ask me. This landing had gone terribly wrong. The captain was trying desperately to keep the plane from losing the little altitude that they had, and he managed to do that. He coaxed the plane till they were somehow over the runway, and then the first officer had had enough. He called for a go-around. The plane flew for another 5 seconds or 350 meters over the runway, and then the captain realized what the first officer realized 5 seconds ago. This landing could not be salvaged, and he said, "Go around." He pushed the toga button. Toga stands for takeoff/go around, and when you hit the toga button, the throttles will be pushed to max engine power, allowing you to get out of a sticky situation real fast. But in this case, that did not happen. The captain hitting the toga thrust button seems to have done nothing. He was pulling back on the yoke, taking the nose higher and higher into the air, but the plane just would not climb. It was now floating above the runway in some sort of weird limbo state, just on the verge of stalling and crashing into the runway. In a bout of desperation, the first officer retracted the flaps and gears in an attempt to streamline the airplane, allowing it to gain some altitude. But even with that, the speed kept dropping. The plane's speed got all the way down to 116 knots at a pitch of 15 degrees. The first officer then looked down to disarm the speed brakes, and that's when he saw what was wrong. I'm guessing he couldn't believe what he was seeing, but right there in front of him was the reason why they couldn't climb. The throttles were at idle. They were trying to perform a go-around on idle power. Immediately, he informed the captain that the thrust was not set for a go-around. The captain immediately told him to push the engines to max power. As the throttles were slammed to their forward stops, the engines started to come to life and the jet finally started to climb away from the airport and certain disaster. Once the jet had climbed away, the pilots decided to land at Toulouse, their alternate airport, as Toulouse had better weather at the time. The plane then made a safe landing and everyone on board was safe. But interestingly enough, when the plane landed, the captain decided to keep quiet about their near accident. How close to disaster they were, you ask? Here's a quote from the report. "Then, the plane came quickly with a high pitch in an attempt to climb, but the speed was low. The aircraft flew over the runway with abnormally high pitch, with the tail at 20 meters from the ground, unable to climb and even lost some altitude. Total horror. We almost saw the plane collapsing at the end of the runway, with the same configuration as Airbus in Hampshire. Then, at the end of the runway, and with this high pitch, it managed slowly to climb, flew very close to a hill, turned left, and was radar vectored to head north again. The plane then went to Toulouse, where it landed, and in a few hours returned to us again." End quote. The plane flew for 1,680 meters or a mile along the runway, just 40 feet off the ground, on the verge of stalling. This is the type of stuff you see at air shows and not a passenger jet doing on a commercial service. So, how did that happen? The short answer is that the throttles were not advanced to go-around power, but the captain hit the toga buttons, thus they should have had been at max power. What happened? Well, the investigative team had 3 theories. Theory 1 was that something had failed in the control system of the plane, meaning that the pilot's commands were not accurately sent to the engines, causing the near accident. The second theory was that the weather had somehow interfered with the plane, preventing the plane from climbing away safely. To address the first hypothesis, the investigators pored over the data to see if something had failed, but they could not find anything that failed. They then looked at the weather. Again, it wasn't the best, but it wasn't the worst either. Nothing that would cause the plane to do what it did. That left one final reason for this near-fatal crash: the pilots themselves. To quote the report, they called it pilot negligence. They went through what the pilots did with a fine-tooth comb, and they found something very interesting. Everything was going smoothly till the first officer turned off the automation and took manual control of the aircraft. But when the first officer could not keep the plane on glide, they should have gone around, but they did not. Instead, the captain continued with the approach. Then, to get the plane back on the glide, the captain turned the autothrottle off and made some aggressive maneuvers. Right there, we have our smoking gun. The toga switches only work if the autothrottle is engaged. Thus, when the captain commanded max power by hitting the switches, nothing happened because the autothrottle was turned off. In this case, the first officer should have been monitoring the systems and the speed of the plane, but he had not transitioned into that role because he had just been the pilot in command just a few moments ago. It would have taken him a while to get up to speed on his new duties, thus it makes sense as to why he didn't catch the mistake sooner. Just to drive home how close these guys were to disaster, we need to look at this phenomenon called a deep stall. We've talked about the deep stall on the channel before in the BAC 111 test flight video. You can find that video on your screen right now. But basically, due to the horizontal stabilizer on the plane being in a T-shape, if the angle of attack is way too high, the elevators can be in the shadow of the wings, and that means that you're gonna have reduced control authority, meaning that you can get into a stall, but you won't be able to get out of it. In the case of Flight 8115, they were right at the edge of getting into a deep stall. Had they nosed up a little bit more, then this story would have ended very, very differently. It is truly amazing that the pilots were able to pull off what they did without crashing the plane. What do you think of all of this? Do you think that Flight 8115 was on the verge of crashing? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.